Hi, everybody. Welcome back to my book, part one of a trilogy called Madame. And this is Madame Bittersweet Goodbyes. This is chapter four. And this is the central character that's arriving today at Madame's home, Linden Hall. If you've been following the story so far, you know that Father Peter is the character is being geared up. There's a reason he becomes a very central part of the whole trilogy. It's more or less based around him, his actions, the way he is as a person. And today we have at last the introduction to a man who's bringing his eminence to meet Madame at Linden Hall and the children for the first time, after his eminence was the one that saved Linden Hall through Father Peter. But Father Peter has always taken the credit for it. Now remember, he didn't sign a certain agreement with Madame in the previous chapter, and we'll start finding out why. But Madame, being ever so shrewd, is in total control of her mental state, her physical state, and now she's starting to become more of a mother to the children. She's starting to have more of a need to put her claws into a situation that Father Peter wants to turn around. It's the start of a real development in the characters of the two main central characters and the bitterness they start having towards each other, both wanting control. Father Peter of the estate, the money, Madame's life, the children's welfare, and Madame of her own life, the children's welfare, and the eradication of Father Peter. And we see a sense of strength in Madame in this chapter. And we see a development to her character, as she was like the Miss Havisham character in the chair in the beginning. She's now grown to be a silhouette, statuesque figure that she once was. She now is getting stronger within, a trait Father Peter finds disturbingly annoying. Tensions are starting to rise. So Father Peter brings the person that has brought his eminence to the home that is now a retirement home for priests, being run very successfully at the helm by Madame, and it's their first introduction. Now remember, we have 5 children, and the whole story of trilogy is seen through Nathan's eyes, who also comes into it, and we see a very mature development of this young man. Another trait that Father Peter wants to eradicate as well. Let's begin of the introduction to whom it will be a very central, pivotal character throughout the trilogy, Father Peter. On the day they arrived, Madame lined up all the maids and butlers in military fashion outside Linden Hall in order of their seniority, and then individually inspected every one of them personally. Only when she was completely satisfied with their appearance did she instruct Fred, the gardener, to open the gates to her arriving guests. Her nerves had begun to surface as her guests were parking their cars. Madame became flustered after noticing a small amount of flour on her dress, which she had picked up whilst inspecting the kitchen. Her elegant black chiffon-lined dress was especially tailor-made for this occasion, and after ridding herself of such an intrusion, Madame adjusted the gold watch brooch pinned to her shoulder and then focused on the task ahead. All the staff remained sombre and unimpressed with the car in which the guests travelled. They had been representing the water. If they had been representing the water temperature, it would have read as freezing. Later on, I asked Nellie, the maid in charge, why the staff had acted in such a manner. She simply wiped her nose and replied in a rather abrasive manner, "When you've seen one important person, Master Nathan, you've seen them all." This, of course, made sense, but it did not stop the hullabaloo that carried on around us for the remainder of the day. The staff rallied round the house, delivering the guests' luggage to their relevant rooms, while ensuring the final details were complete. It was chaotic. Father Peter had brought with him 3 extra staff, all very young priests, I'm sure he planned to impress with stories of how he had turned Linden Hall into the success that it was today. I felt even though that they had the minds of their own, Father Peter had alternative motives for taking these young curates to Linden Hall. As the day went on, both Nellie and I decided to escape the drudgery of sneaking off to have a cigarette. We found a space at the back of the old stables and placed two crates alongside each other and puffed away to our heart's content, blowing the smoke out of the little window. It was such a beautiful evening, and everybody was now winding down, having eaten the late lunch. We relaxed by chit-chatting and listening to the musical notes sung by some neighbouring birds. You should not be smoking at such a young age, Master Nathan. If Madame appears, it'll be the last time I set eyes on you, as she'd banish me forever for allowing you to do so, warned Nellie. It's okay, Nellie, for I'll not tell anybody if you don't. Honestly, women now, don't be worrying about it. I'm a big boy now, I mocked. It's the main woman you ought to be worried about. Don't you know that smoking stunts your growth, my dear, and that you'll end up with no hair on your chest? Now, how would that make you look? Nudged Nellie. So I wouldn't have any hair, eh? What a pity. Then maybe I should donate some of it whilst I can to the baldy Archbishop for that big baldy head of his, I replied, laughing. Aye, you're an awful Master Nathan. That tongue of yours will get you into trouble one day. And if you're not careful, said Nellie, nodding her head, it'll be sooner than you think. Only the best kind of trouble, I'm sure, I replied, grinning. With that remark, I swirled my tongue on outwards. Then, as we were sitting finishing our cigarettes, we heard a ruffled sound of footsteps coming towards us. Next, we heard the garbage dustbin being disturbed, while the sudden movement of a man's shadow became clearly visible. It was Luke. Relieved and feeling quite lightheaded, I approached him. At the same time, Nellie was making her escape back through the pantry door, winking at me as she fled to the safety of the kitchen. On approaching Luke, I became dizzy and walked into the garbage, falling forward. Jesus, Nathan, is this where you're at? He said. Madame has been looking for you everywhere. She's incensed by your disappearance, especially since you left straight after the initial greeting ceremony. You of all people should know the importance of protocol, tutted Luke. Ah, for Christ's sake, Luke, get a life, I said. It's not important, trust me. Some day you'll realise this, I snapped. There's no need to get all heavy with me, brother dearest. Just prepare for the worst, that's all, Luke replied. Lead the way, Luke, lead the way, I scoffed. I was greeted with hostility, not just by Madame, but also by the rest of my brothers. They stood motionless as Madame announced my arrival to her guests. Well, the dead arose and appeared to many. Welcome, Nathan. Your absence has been duly noted, son, but never mind. You're here now, and that's all that matters. We shall speak later, though, said Madame in a harsh tone. Luke broke the lingering silence by announcing that he had found me and brought his long-lost brother back to those that loved him. After I successfully outstared Father Peter, my attention was drawn to the corner of the room. There sat a frail old man, a wretched-looking man, in fact. The wine-coloured cardigan he wore underneath his jacket took my attention away from the haggard appearance. Perched in the corner of the room, he seemed almost immortal. Both his hands were occupied, one holding a Cuban cigar, something which had become very popular, and the other holding a crystal decanter, filled with the very best of brandy. His cardigan seemed to match his rosy red cheeks. He suddenly stopped laughing. Although his hand had a firm grip of the brandy decanter, he managed to flick one of his fingers into an outward position, and then beckoned me with it to move forward. Well, indeed, it's Master Nathan, who's finally graced us with his presence. Nathan, is it? Please come to me. I promise I won't bite, insisted His Eminence the Archbishop. Your Eminence, it's not your bite. Excuse me, everybody. It's not your bite I'd be scared of. They do say that the bark is always worse, I replied. Nathan, screeched the disgruntled Madame, and how dare you speak to the Archbishop like that? Oh, I do beg your forgiveness, Your Eminence. Nathan, apologise at once, implored Madame. What for, Madame? You seem very touchy this afternoon. I'm sure His Eminence can find a space in his big, fat heart to forgive my wee bit of impertinence, I replied. It's okay, madame. It's obviously the frisky one you have here. Father Peter told me to look out for you, Nathan. You show strength of character, which will stand you the test of time, my son, replied His Eminence. Time is something that my brothers and I have plenty of, considering we're not allowed to ever venture out of Linden Hall. Therefore, this strength of character you talk about is something I'm quite glad to possess, I remarked. Quite so, Nathan. However, Madame informs me that your life holds no disappointments for you as such, living here at Linden Hall. Still, I would say that you're harder to please than the rest of the children here before me. Yes, there is a big world outside those four walls. I have no doubt that someday, Nathan, you'll find out this for yourself. Nevertheless, Father Peter does assure me that you want for nothing here. Disappointment, Nathan, is an inevitable part of everyday life, smiled His Eminence. I've my doubts, I said. Words about the world is like outside the walls of Linden Hall mean nothing to me, Your Eminence. I can only say that disappointment from never experiencing that outside world is something that my brothers and I experience daily, I sighed. But Nathan, how can you say that? How can you stand there and tell me a lifestyle where you want for nothing still leaves you with feelings of disappointment? The outside world you come from could never have provided you with all the things that you have here now. Then, of course, I'm a great believer in to please some of the people some of the time, but never all of the people all of the time. I choose to ignore your endeavour to turn this evening into a verbal farce, for whatever reason, added His Eminence. Madame, we seem to have become sidetracked. I'm very sorry. Please accept my apology to both yourself and His Eminence. Please can you forgive me? I apologise profusely, I pleaded. Quite, Nathan. Let us continue our evening as planned, replied Madame, through gritted teeth. Glad that's all over, whispered Luke. It's getting to a critical stage, judging by Father Peter's expression. Me too, chorused Marcus. I'd love to know what Nathan was getting at. He was all over the place. It seems to me that he's always angry these days. I certainly don't want to rock the boat by annoying Father Peter. If it was a choice between living here as a recluse or in the workhouse, I know where I'd choose, added Marcus. Next, Madame swiftly led the way to the dining room, followed by His Eminence, and then each of us in turn. Father Peter waited to walk beside me. We walked in a slow and awkward manner, passing all the staff as they stood motionless in the hallway, all except Nellie. She winked at me and then proceeded to wipe her nose in an unhygienic manner by blowing it gently into the corner of her apron. Catching her in action, Father Peter attacked her verbally for her insolence. His attack did not deter her in the slightest, and she simply curtsied and walked away, laughing to herself and scratching her posterior. I could not help but laugh with her, aware that Father Peter was unnerved by her sheer boldness. Does that woman not know who I am? Asked Father Peter in a stressed voice. I'm sure this is the case, Father Peter. However, you'll find someone who wears a long skirt and has a similar attire to those that he is supposed to be senior over will never be taken seriously. I suppose it's just one of those disappointments His Eminence was talking about, I replied in a mocking tone. Upon entering the dining room, Madame was happy because on this particular occasion she had surpassed even her own high expectations. As the evening sunlight shone beautifully through the bay windows, her lavish display of silver lit up the whole room. Placed upon the table in front of the chair we were to sit, our names were inscribed with the blood-red ink onto white folded paper. This added a touch of class to the whole ensemble. At dinner, I ended up sitting next to Father Peter. This in itself I thought would make for a very entertaining evening. The Archbishop took his place at the head of the table, looking down on the rest of us with a look of satisfaction painted all over his face. When we'd all settled down, I noticed Adam and Luke fiddling with the crockery and cutlery, obviously in nervous anticipation of the evening ahead. And after noticing me watching them, they smiled over in my direction. I nodded back to them, trying to reassure them that everything would just be fine. In a tone of self-importance, the Archbishop coughed repeatedly until there was silence throughout the room. We all stared at him and waited patiently for his speech. Let me begin. I welcome you all here on this glorious autumn evening. I'm very honoured to be here, and at last to be able to put faces to those names which I've become familiar. Madame, you have indeed done us proud, and have gone to great lengths to ensure that our stay will be one we shall never forget. Thank you. May I also thank your staff for the fine display which they have laid before us here this evening? I've no doubt that I speak for everyone when I say this. As a mother and a figurehead of society, I've long awaited the opportunity to meet you. You have done a splendid job in raising these 5 young men as your own. Saving them from a life of uncertainty, you ought to be very proud of your achievements. Well done to you. You're truly a modern-day saint. You are an inspiration to everyone around, providing just what can be achieved through an unselfish act of love. May I raise a toast, along with everybody here, celebrating you, Madame, and all your wonderful achievements. To Madame, shouted His Eminence, raising his glass. A nervous and tearful Madame then held up a glass. In turn we all rose from our seats and one by one toasted her. Immediately she began to flutter her eyelashes in what can only be described as an uncontrollable manner. Next she became panic-stricken and began to wave her hand freely, repeatedly around in circles. I noticed her eyes seemed strained and she looked towards us, acknowledging each of us in turn. Madame looked down with tear-filled eyes. Proudly we responded by filling the room with the sounds of cheers and lots of ahs and oohs. And then all of a sudden, with a glazed look in her eyes, Madame dropped her wineglass abruptly, shouting the words, "Shite! Shite! Oh, shite! Ah!" One of her false eyelashes had caught the corner of her eye. This caused her to curse even more. Her outlandish performance was something you'd expect from Nellie after a couple of drinks, not from Madame, and certainly not in the presence of the Archbishop and Father Peter. Tugging and pulling at her eyes, Madame rose to her feet, screeching, then tossed and turned from side to side as if she was squatting flies. Jesus Christ, get out! Oh. At last, all done. Now, please don't fret. Now do sit down. Honestly, it's nothing that any of you have to worry about. These little buggers are a nightmare I got from Paris to get in, and a horror of a thing to get out if they sit wrongly on your eye. I wish I never bought them at all. Why, damn well bother, I'll never know. Hiccuped Madame, slumping back into a chair in a mangled fashion, hiccuping repeatedly. Madame realised she was intoxicated, and Father Peter, ever the opportunist, whispered sarcastically to his Eminence. Drunk, your Eminence? After the fine speech you made? Isn't it a pity? Madame will have no recollection of it whatsoever. Looking undeterred at Father Peter, but also with disappointment, his Eminence could only muster up the word, quite, to Father Peter's smug approval. When Madame had regained composure, she sat up, drinking some water, and overhearing Father Peter's snide remarks about her, Marcus took it upon himself to intervene. He emphasised that her behaviour was totally out of character for Madame. Marcus then apologised to his Eminence on her behalf, putting her behaviour down to complete exhaustion due to the effort she had put in preparing for his Eminence's visit. Marcus added that he had not realised how much stress Madame had been under until now. With pride, his Eminence replied, "Don't worry, son. These things are part of a person's nature," he responded. In Madame's situation, it's a case of different courses for different horses, as they say. I'm partial to the odd whisky myself, he winked. Madame is still a fine person. However, I think she should either rest now or eat a little if she can manage it, he continued. Thank you, Your Eminence. Let the rest of us now eat, for we're all starving, Nelly. You can bring out the food now. Brothers, eat until you're popping at the waistline. Madame, if you're not up to eating, just try the soup, suggested Marcus. Madame, asked Father Peter, are you sure you're all right? For you seem awfully pale. I'll gladly escort you to your room if you're not feeling well. In a deep breath, Madame replied, I am fine, Father Peter. Then, composed, turned round and looked at everybody and said, thank you all the same. A good hearty meal is all I need to sort me out, she replied hastily. Madame filled yet another glass of wine, and then she spoke completely erratically to our brother Tom, laughing a lot to the amusement of the rest of us, and she informed Tom very loudly how she could remember the first day he arrived at Linden Hall. She told us of all how he was so scared being at Linden Hall and being the first one that Sheila had to put a nappy on him. He'd filled 3 nappies on that day, much to the horror of the staff, who had to clean up after him. My poor innocent son. How glad I was to have you here to rear you properly myself, she smiled. Just before she began doing hand actions to the story, Tom became very annoyed. Grabbing her hand and holding it down firmly and gently, he leaned over and whispered, Stop it at once! Cautiously, he then patted her hand, and she realized something was amiss. During the rest of the evening, Madame became more and more intoxicated. In turn, Father Peter became more and more condescending of her actions, much to His Eminence's annoyance. Father Peter revelled in Madame's sudden demise in front of everybody. He behaved like a peacock, spreading its feathers in a display of showmanship in front of the tired audience. As he rambled on about his trips around the world, it became obvious to everyone that he loved the sound of his own voice. The cooing and the croaking of his voice served only one purpose, to highlight his own self-importance. Nevertheless, as the evening progressed, we enjoyed a huge selection of fine food the cooks had prepared for us. Our taste buds on this very special occasion were spoiled by an assortment of delicious foods, and Madame even allowed us to share a bottle of wine between us. Unfortunately, however, she decided to finish the bottle herself, telling us all, what a fine vintage it is. We should always savour each mouthful of such a delicious wine to the end. It was like a reenactment of love scene from Romeo and Juliet, watching Madame kissing the bottle, licking the glass in her hand and sucking her fingers one by one to catch every morsel of wine. Sadly, it just highlighted the relationship she now had with the bottle. It seemed she wanted us all to watch as she single-handedly changed the whole perception Father Peter and His Eminence had of her. I secretly wondered, was she deliberately rebelling against them for another reason? My brothers and I spent most of the evening chatting to His Eminence about football and hurling. That was until he decided to change the conversation to that of Madame, Linden Hall, and the fact that Linden Hall had become one of the most profitable bed and breakfast retreats of its kind. He emphasized how lucky we were to be part of it all. For this reason, we kept quiet about our own feelings in regards to Linden Hall. The Archbishop noticed our hesitation in conversing on the subject and decided to stop quizzing us for any more information after about half an hour. He also noticed our hostility towards Father Peter, so much so that he'd not even attempt to ask about our study or the exams that were fast approaching. With His Eminence residing in our home, we decided to use this to our advantage. We convinced him that Father Peter had once promised to take us all to a local football match, a reward for studying so hard each year, but that due date had never come. His Eminence was a shrewd man, smiled, and then agreed under strict supervision. He could see no reason why we could not leave the confines of the house for at least one day. Obviously, he would put strict guidelines into place. Delighted, we all felt this was bound to have happened at some stage, with or without his consent. But it was great that it happened earlier than later. Overhearing this conversation, Madame cried with joy and then congratulated all of us with hugs and kisses and winked for being so shrewd. My brothers and I were now between 8 and 10 years of age. As all of us sat waiting for Father Peter's reaction, he surprised us by agreeing with His Eminence. He then smiled at us, stood up and raised his glass of whisky and a toast, saying "Sláinte," and then sat back down, wiping the sweat from his brow. Elated, Madame then announced that she was retiring to bed. I therefore lifted her up from the table and asked Sheila to escort her to her room. Once Madame had left, Father Peter and His Eminence suggested we all adjourn to the library for a nightcap. Although there was obvious hesitation amongst my brothers, I persuaded them to follow His Eminence. There we remained sitting politely on the leather suite, watching all of the priests enjoying a fine cognac and smoking their expensive cigars. Adam had somehow managed to slip away unnoticed by Father Peter or anybody else, and Father Peter spoke about morals and society and explained to us how the Church forgave the sins of the people like unmarried mothers by relieving them of their children and allowing them to have a new life. The Church would then rear the children in the workhouses, he explained, until proper parents came along to adopt them. My brothers were not easily impressed by any of this conversation. They just looked at each other and sighed heavily. They just wanted to play in the games room or sit next to me. And out of politeness, each of them remained sitting and continued to listen to the drunken rambles of Father Peter. I remained standing in the hope that I would unnerve Father Peter somewhat, and this was something that Madame had taught me. Although I knew I was an intelligent boy, I had a tendency to forget that I was only 5 feet tall. "You're no more than 2 inches taller than a piss pot," Nellie used to jeer when I was younger. As the evening progressed, Father Peter stood towering over us, flapping his wings even further. He had a tendency to talk with his hands, which infuriated me to the point of distraction. This man dared to talk about morals when he had increased the land taxes on the estate, and then left it to Madame to tell the workers they no longer had jobs if they did not pay the increased rent. To her horror, Madame had found out later that Father Peter saved a lot of the money on wages by not paying the boys from the workhouses. He still claimed for these wages from Rome. However, Father Peter redirected the money into a private church fund, which Madame was not aware until much later that had existed. Ironically, even though the church governed Linden Hall, any excess money was supposed to go to Madame for Linden Hall and its upkeep. And Sheila discussed this with Madame when settling her into bed one evening after retiring from dinner. Sheila showed her the account book, and Madame immediately felt a conspiracy was going on by Father Peter. This was fraudulent in her eyes. Having money going into the church fund was as good as taking it out of her pocket. Madame's problem now was whether to tell His Eminence about it or not. She needed to have things sorted, and soon, and His Eminence had requested the account books to look at before his departure. Madame's own signature was required for any money transactions, regardless of where it was deposited, and she spent the evening trying to figure out how Father Peter had managed to get her signature on a lodgement cheque that went into the church funds. And if things could not get any worse, Father Peter started lecturing my brothers and me about our physical development. He said that as we were now approaching our teenage years, we would notice some body hair beginning to grow in unusual places and start to think bad thoughts. He gave us some examples of so-called bad thoughts and told us that when we had these, we should immediately go to either him or one of the other priests for confession. Luke, as brazen as you like, quipped, "They don't sound that bad to me. In fact, I can't wait till I have these thoughts. They sound like great fun." Before Father Peter could react, His Eminence laughed and told Luke, "I'm sure you can't wait, my boy. They come to us all." With the sound of laughter now echoing through the library, my brothers sought their chance to ask if they could go to bed. I stayed for a while longer, using the excuse that I was the eldest and did not feel tired. This is when I heard Father Peter tell the younger priest he was giving the boys this information in the hope that it would give them some sort of awareness of the body changes that would happen to them, adding it would also make them less innocent and enhance their relationship with God through confession. He stated that it was only through the teaching of God that the boys could become morally strong young men, ready to take on the next challenge, the outside world, when the time was right. He continues saying that it would always be of benefit to my brothers and me to know right from wrong, and he felt it was right to inform us of these body changes, for we would need the priest's help in coping when these occurred. A little confused by his train of thought, his guest simply nodded. Then, turning his attention to me, he reiterated what the Archbishop had said. The world was waiting for boys with the natural skill to handle themselves like myself. Well, according to the rumours of the workhouse, Father Peter, you have many natural skills of your own. You seem to have a special talent for developing the needs of young boys, something which I've no doubt you have mastered over the years being in charge of so many at the maze, I said. I smiled. Well, really, for a boy so young and so well advanced, both mentally and emotionally, I'm shocked by your wicked response, Nathan. How can you dare to imply such nonsense? Scolded His Eminence. You must follow your brothers and go to your room at once, so I cannot listen to this kind of talk from one so young. Now go! Whatever it is that ails you, young man, may you find the asking of the Lord's guidance for help. I want you to say 5 Our Fathers and 1 Hail Mary. Now be gone before I get any angrier. As I was leaving the room, Father Peter grabbed my arm and scolded me for displaying such arrogance, stating that my outburst would not be forgotten, not even after he left Linden Hall. I replied that his threats didn't bother me. In fact, I felt calm and relieved after my outburst. I held his gaze until Father Peter, through gritted teeth, hissed at me. How dare you imply such things about me in front of the Archbishop? You pompous son of a whore! Let me guarantee you one thing. You'll suffer for this, little boy. You think you're safe with Madame, here to protect you. Well, let me remind you that you will not last forever. You speak far beyond your 10 years, Nathan. However, you'll become a child once again, especially when you don't have Madame. This will happen sooner than you think. I promise you, Father Peter whispered erratically. Pompous son of a whore, am I? You knew my mother well, did you? I whispered back. Well, know this also, Father Peter. That big bad world out there will also wait for justice. The kind of justice it will get when you trip yourself up. How dare you speak to anybody about morals? You're worse than Sodom and Gomorrah combined. I will bide my time until a time when the church will no longer protect you, even if it takes years for this to happen. I know my feelings about you shall be confirmed some day. I snapped, pushing his arm away. The conversation came to an abrupt end as Sheila approached and began to tidy up. Through the corner of my eye, I could see Father Peter and Sheila secretly whispering to each other. I tried to forget about what I had just seen, and instead I made my way to the kitchen. There I came across Nellie chatting to John, her husband, the butler. As I came closer, I realised they were in fact bickering quite loudly. Taking off my shoes, I stood quietly outside the door listening, and I was horrified to see how upset Nellie was, but not nearly as horrified as I was by what I heard. Blaspheme, will he? Who exactly does that priest think he is? I don't need to be reminded where I came from. That'll always be ingrained in my memory. Not even the drink will erase the memory of the painful existence I had in the care of those damned nuns. My bones still ache when I think back to how they treated all of us in that convent. And I still have the bruises to prove it, Nellie shouted aloud. I remember, John, the face of that man. His Eminence, is it now? Well, to me, he'll always be Father Matthew. He used to be sweet and innocent until he obtained the power those priests have over us common folk, added Nelly. Trust me, John. Father Peter is now doing his dirty work for him. Maybe the two of them have worked it out between them. Whatever it is, those children were taken away from the workhouse of this, I'm sure. In the middle of the night, the strangers came to collect the children, so there would be no witnesses. Then sold, I've no doubt, to the highest bidder. It's wrong, John, and nobody is doing anything about it, because they're all too damn scared to point to the finger to the church, sobbed Nelly. Hush, Nelly. Somebody might hear us, and you, and where would we be? Separated, that's where. I'm hurting as much as you are. I know a man isn't supposed to show or feel emotion, but I do. I know they took your baby from you, but you've got to remember it was my child too. You say you'll never forget him, but I've never had the chance to see him. How do you think that makes me feel? Your pain is also my pain, but right now we must pull ourselves together, woman. If anyone overhears us, the real reason why we have worked here all these years will be exposed. Not even if we can take on the church, but maybe we will someday get access to those files that are rumoured to be here at Linden Hall. Or the maze, which might tell us where our child is, cried John uncontrollably. Bastards, John. That's what they are. Complete and utter bastards. God forgive me, but I hope those nuns and priests rot in hell for the suffering they've caused our innocence. The type of pain and suffering which those poor little blighters must still be dealing with in that workhouse, and the convent is damnable. If there's a God above, he'll send somebody this day to help them, for sure. Anyway, we should go to bed. Are you coming? Wept a tired Nelly. Shall you go first, and I'll join you later, I promise. Now be careful on those stairs. Firstly, I'll lock up, and then I'll be back, John replied, kissing Nelly on her cheek. Watching through a crack in the panelling of the door, I saw Nelly struggle from her chair and mumble something silently. Through laboured breathing, she hit the air with her fist, declaring, "Those damned cigarettes are going to be the death of me." She walked towards the door, and I slipped back up the stairs and into the kitchen, replacing my shoes back on. Then I came across Sheila, who startled me. Clothed all in black, she looked very suspicious. My, Nasty Nathan, what ails you at this hour? Everyone, it seems, has already gone to bed. Why are you not in bed? Inquired Sheila. No reason, I replied, other than hungry. And where might you be off to at this time of night, when everyone else is in bed? I answered back sarcastically. That's typical of you, Martha Nathan. You always answer a question with a question. I like to go for a walk at night. It helps to clear my head, and after a long day, tires me so that I may sleep better on later. Now you run along. We don't want Madame finding you down here and becoming more upset than she already is over your antics today. Now do we? Sheila replied sternly. Enjoy your midnight walk, Sheila, and tread carefully. We wouldn't want anything to happen to you, now would we? I mocked. Actually, your concern flatters me now. Now run along, like a good boy, and take this leftover hot milk. It'll help you sleep. And don't be worried about me. The dark is something I'm not afraid of, replied Sheila through clenched eyes. I could hear Nelly making her way up the basement stairs, and so I heeded Sheila's advice and went quickly to my room. I was tired and wearisome, and fell into bed as soon as I had undressed. My head whirled out of control, and my eyes ached from pure fatigue. I felt sick from the cigarettes I had smoked. The stupidity of my youth certainly didn't do me any favours. And then it happened again. In a dreamlike state, I could hear what sounded like the children whispering my name all around me. At first their voices were faint, and then they became clearer, as if they were talking beside me. I became very confused as the calling became louder and louder. I covered my ears with my pillow. and in an effort to block out the sound, but it wouldn't go away. I became more and more frustrated, shouting at them to leave me alone. My shouts to leave me alone travelled across the room, and the next thing I remember was seeing Marcus standing over me with both his hands tugging at my pillow to wake me up. In all the confusion, I thought that the children to whom these voices belonged were trying to suffocate me. I was just about to scream when Marcus covered my mouth with one hand and held me down with the other, repeating my name to wake up. Upon realizing who it was, I regained my composure. I got up. After pacing around the room a few times, I became calmer, but remained lost for words. Just as I was about to speak, Marcus noticed something hanging on the door. That is part 1 of chapter 4. Part 2 of chapter 4